I'm very honored and excited to be hosting, to be moderating this event. My name is Tim Heise, and I'm a 2L here at the law school and a board member of the Federalist Society. For some of you that might be unfamiliar with the Federalist Society, we are in fact awesome. I just wanted you to know that. It's in the bylaws. No, but seriously, we're founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom and that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution. Pretty much, and any of the board members will tell you that we like ideas. We like to debate them, win or lose, hopefully win, and punch holes in them, strengthen them, weaken them as the case may require. And we welcome that. You can see myself or one of the other board members who I'll introduce in a second for information joining our organization. And if you find yourself opposed to our principles and ideologies, I recommend you to look into the UND chapter of the American Constitutional Society, which will be having their first meeting tomorrow at the lunch hour in room 211. Our board members are our President Trevor, Vice President Jonathan, Chris Lacates, our secretary, and myself, and our advisor is Professor McGinnis. So, besides being an election law dork, the idea of talking about election law issue is very important, I think, and very current and very important to our democracy. We not only do we have a major election in less than a month, but in the last decade we've seen things like Bush v. Gore and many other arguments both in the media and among our classmates about voter ID, the good, the bad, the ugly, and that's what I hope we get to talk about today. And just a comment about Bush v. Gore, it is my hope that we never have that again, whether you like the outcome or not. The reasoning for it, and I think, had major unintended consequences or detrimental impact because of the confidence, due to the confidence of our election system. And that's why I want to talk about what we're talking about today. And what we're talking about today, obviously, as you've seen, is voter ID, yes or no, but it's basically about two civil rights. One is, that I'm sure all of you know that have taken constitutional law with Morrison, it is the right to be able to vote, not to be disenfranchised, not to be artificially stopped or literally stopped to vote. That's a very important civil right. And then also, too, and the Supreme Court has said just as importantly, it's to make sure your vote counts. That it is just as disenfranchised if your vote is canceled out due to someone voting multiple times or someone is voting that should not be voting. And that's another way that you can lose your right to vote as well. And we need to protect both rights. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And it's our goal to have an efficient and accurate and fair election that people can have confidence in. And I think that's one of the most important things about our topic today. So the format of this panel is simply each speaker can speak 10 to 15 to 20 minutes as far as however they would like. Each person has been selected for their expertise, and I will introduce each person before they speak. And then after they speak, we're going to have questions and answers. Please think of your questions and answers while, not the answers, think of your questions that you're going to ask, because this is going to be a vital importance to our panel. And we're going to have two roving mics. Please speak into the microphone because we are recording it, and that's the only way for it to be recorded. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Is actually going to be Al Jaeger. Mr. Jaeger has been elected to the office of North Dakota Secretary of State in 1992 and re-elected in 1996, 2000, 2006, and 2010. As the Secretary of State, he serves as the Chief Election Officer among many, many other constitutionally mandated duties. He received a bachelor's degree from Dickinson State University and served in the North Dakota National Guard. He has served 8 different terms on the Executive Committee of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And please, let's give Mr. Jaeger, Secretary Jaeger, a round of applause.
Thank you, Tim. What I intend to do today, and as part of my part of the panel, is just explain what is North Dakota law, what it currently is, and what our identification requirements are. To begin with, I think we should first start out with the fact that who's an eligible voter in the state of North Dakota? Number one, you have to be a United States citizen. Number two, you have to be 18 years of age. And number three, you have to have lived in your residency for at least 30 days in the precinct in which you intend to vote. That's the basic requirements. Now, in 1992, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act. That was like in September, October, when that became law. The North Dakota legislature starts meeting January, and so we didn't have a lot of time, but we did have to put together legislation for the legislature to consider to implement a number of provisions that were prompted by the Help America Vote Act. One of those things that came out of that passage of that legislation is an identification requirement. And so when individuals come to the polls and want to vote, they have to show some type of identification. It was modified a little bit in the next session, it gave me a little bit more latitude, but essentially in North Dakota, there is no one single piece of identification that is required. We allow the use of a number of different ways that you can identify that you are a qualified elector of that particular precinct. Two things are very important with that. The identification has to show your residency and it has to show your birth date. Those are two essential requirements of the identification requirement. On election day, the most common form of identification that is provided is a driver's license. That's the most common. And many of our voting precincts now are set up with electronic poll books. When I go to vote, I pull out my driver's license, they flip it around, they put it under a little light and it scans it, my name pops up on the poll book. Now, in North Dakota, we do have one unique distinction nationwide. North Dakota is the only state that doesn't have voter registration. I'm very thankful for that. It works exceedingly well. We do not have a history of fraud. And I have been quoted a number of times in the national media and different places when I say dead people don't vote in North Dakota. And I know in states that do have voter registration, I'm told that that does happen from time to time. And here we don't have any evidence that that really takes place. So we do have a rather unique system and it works well. But we do have what is called a central voter file. It isn't a record of who can vote, it is a record of who has voted. And all it is that in elections going back to most likely statehood, when a person came in to vote, their name was entered into a poll book. And that was a record that they had voted. And that poll book was maintained by each of the state's 53 counties. All we have now is a system that takes those 53 poll books or poll books from those 53 counties and centralizes the information in one gigantic poll book, which is a database that is housed in Bismarck. And so when a person comes in to vote, they show their identification. It pops up on the screen. They say, Al Jaeger, you still live at 3619 Hackberry Street, Bismarck, yes. And I'm given a ballot and I can proceed to vote. I would suspect that that's probably the case in probably 90% of the situations. We also accept what is a state-issued identification. There are people who do not have a driver's license for a variety of reasons, cannot drive, but the DOT does issue a identification card. So that can be used. Now, you know that the driver's license has a photograph. It is not a requirement of North Dakota law that any form of identification that is provided to the election board on election day has to have a photo. That's not a requirement. We take a number of different things. They come in with a passport that shows their residency and also a birth date, that's accepted, a tribal issued card, a military identification card. We actually accept a utility bill. If it has your name on it and it was dated within 30 days of the election, that it can show that your name is on it and your address matches to what you're saying it would be, you're given a ballot and entered into the system. We have absentee voting, and in that particular process, you submit an application, and in submitting that, you have to sign your name. And that comes into the county auditor's office. Again, with our system, the name is entered into the system. And so we know statewide, we know in Bismarck that you've applied for an absentee ballot. We know when that absentee ballot was mailed out to the voter. We know when the voter returns it. And you, as a voter, if you vote by absentee ballot, you're able to track that on our website, and you're able to see that that's happened. So some of you who are college students, or of course you're college students, excuse me, but some of you are here and you want to vote back home. That's the process that you would follow. And as a college student here, you can vote back in Mercer County and Golden Valley County, Burleigh County, wherever home is, you're allowed to vote. But as a college student, you also have a choice. You can vote absentee, or because you have lived in Grand Forks at a Grand Forks address, you're a United States citizen, you're 18 years of age, and you have lived in your precinct for 30 days, you can choose to vote in Grand Forks. Now, when you do that, you give up your voting right back home. And if you decide that you'd like to vote here in back home, I would recommend that you not do that. The reason is that whether you do the affidavit or actually show up at the polls, when you show your identification, of course, there's certain information that is asked of you. And before we had this, guess what happens now? Your name is entered into a central database, and if you attempt to vote the second time, guess what? We're going to know it. So we do have a deterrent in terms of the credibility of the election. Now, for those of you, all of you, I should say all of you have access to the state's PeopleSoft system. And if you go on your page on the PeopleSoft system, I believe on the left-hand side there is a link to voter information. And if you click on that, you will see a letter that has my name on the bottom that essentially describes what I have just told you. You can follow that through. You can go on our website. You can download your application. You can get it sent in. You can fax it in. You can scan it, send it to your county auditor. The main thing is your signature has to appear, because if you vote absentee and you receive a ballot, when you return the ballot, You sign on the back an affidavit under penalty of law, if it's proven to be false at some point, but you sign that this is your residence, your mom and dad's place, and you sign it. And when that comes in, it's compared to the signature that was on the application. And if they're somewhat dissimilar, I suspect somebody's going to be following up on that. Fortunately, in North Dakota, we do not have a history of voter fraud, and so that's very good. Those of you that choose to vote in Grand Forks, but your driver's license has your home address from Burleigh County. In other words, it doesn't match your Grand Forks address. If you go on the website, it automatically populates this letter that is from me. And the university has in their system, they have your Grand Forks address. So they know where you live here in Grand Forks. If you print that out and take it with you to the polls, this will be one form of identification because it shows the address of your precinct or where you live within that precinct. And of course, if you have your driver's license, guess what? It has your date of birth on there. So you've met the requirements of law. Now, what if you show up at the polling location here in Grand Forks and you want to vote, you didn't print out the letter, you have a driver's license from back home, but you don't have anything that shows your residential address. Under North Dakota law, if there happens to be a poll worker who knows you personally, they can vouch for you. And they note that in the record that they've vouched for you. If none of those options are available, you are required to sign a voter's affidavit. Essentially, that's kind of the same thing that's on the absentee ballot. And again, you are under penalty, perjury of law, whatever the legal term is. When you sign that and say, this is where I live, 1100 University Avenue, I'm just making up an address, Grand Forks, North Dakota, this is where I live, and you sign that, you are then given a ballot. That county auditor has to follow up after the election, and if it's discovered that the voter doesn't really match that, I would suspect somebody's going to come calling. So there's a number of different ways to vote in North Dakota. It's very easy. It's not that hard. It's no one single type of identification. The important thing, it has to show your address, your name, and your birth date. And that's the requirements in North Dakota. And I asked him to go first because one of the things that was talked about is photo ID. And, right now, from a legislative standpoint, I'm not aware of any movement in North Dakota to go to a photo ID, but there's 130, 140 legislators that I have discovered in 10 sessions and 20 years in office that sometimes have a mind of their own in terms of what they're going to propose. But right now, I'm not aware of any strong movement towards it. So that Tim, I'll finish up my part.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Next we will be hearing from Hans von Spakovsky, who is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a former member of the Federal Election Commission, and has been an election official in Georgia and Virginia. Previously enforced federal voting rights law at the Department of Justice as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He is the co-author of the recently published Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk, and we'll be donating a copy to the library. He received a bachelor's degree from MIT and a JD from Vanderbilt.
Well, I'm sure you all are here to hear us speak, not because there was free pizza, right? Before I get going, I do want to tell you, since all of you are law students, that I work at the Heritage Foundation, and we do have an internship program there. So if you're looking for an internship for next summer, I would recommend you go to the website and check it out. We hire a large number of interns every summer, and unlike a lot of internships in Washington, we actually pay. And second, we do something else which is also a pretty good benefit in Washington. We actually provide housing for our interns too, which is pretty expensive in the city. So if you're interested in working for a think tank like the Heritage Foundation, I'd recommend you check out the site. I was asked to come talk about voter fraud, and one of the recommendations that's been made that a number of states are implementing to deter some of that, and that's voter ID. Now, you're going to hear from opponents of voter ID that there's no voter fraud in the United States. Well, unfortunately, the United States has a long history of voter fraud, and examples of such fraud have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists. And not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but it could affect the outcome of a close election. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of the United States Supreme Court in 2008, when it upheld Indiana's photo ID law. And unlike what some of you may think, that was not a 5-4 decision by the conservatives. It was a 6-3 decision, and the majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens. Those of you who've taken constitutional law know that he was one of the liberal stalwarts of the United States Supreme Court. And he wrote this opinion upholding the photo ID law of Indiana, which the court at the time said was the strictest photo ID law in the country. Now, part of the problem the plaintiffs in that case have, particularly the ACLU, who is there arguing that there's just no voter fraud in the United States, is they seem to have forgotten that before Justice John Paul Stevens became a justice on the United States Supreme Court, he practiced as a lawyer in Chicago. So the idea that there's no voter fraud really didn't play with him. This book that came out in August, I wrote with John Fund, who's done a lot of reporting, particularly for the Wall Street Journal, about voter fraud. There's case after case after case in here about voter fraud prosecutions around the country and voter fraud prosecutions that changed election outcomes. Just one example is we talk about a 2005 Senate race, state Senate race in Tennessee that was won by 13 votes. It was later overturned by the state legislature after an investigation, after they discovered that there were enough fraudulent votes to overturn the election, including votes by people who were dead, actually including a very famous folk artist whose works are in the Smithsonian, who supposedly showed up at his polling place 6 weeks after he was dead and cast a ballot. They also found people whose registered address were vacant lots in the city of Memphis. So voter fraud happens. Now, what you won't find in this book are examples of voter fraud that have occurred just in the last month. You got any doubts about this? I suggest get out your laptop, do a Google search, and you'll find everything from a Democratic congressional candidate in Maryland who 2 weeks ago, the Maryland Democratic Party had to write kind of an embarrassing letter to the governor taking her name off the ballot. Why? Because they had discovered that she had registered and voted in both Maryland and Florida in the 2006 and 2008 elections. 2 weeks ago, there were 3 people arrested in Iowa, 2 Canadians and a Mexican, for illegally registering and voting in U.S. elections, even though they weren't non-citizens. A Mexican drug dealer about 3 weeks ago was indicted in California. He's in the United States illegally, and among the many charges were that he had registered and voted in American elections. Also, about a month ago, you'll find, if you do a Google search, that an Arkansas state legislator resigned from office after pleading guilty to voter fraud along with 3 other individuals, and the fraud that he committed and the fraudulent ballots that they were able to cast were in a legislative race that he won by 8 votes. And that is the point. In a close election, voter fraud can make a difference. Now, when Governor Lincoln Chafee, who's an independent, not a Republican, not a Democrat, signed Rhode Island's new photo ID law. He said this: requiring ID at the polling place is a reasonable request to ensure the accuracy and integrity of our elections. That law, by the way, was sponsored by an African-American Democratic state senator who said that he had seen voter fraud committed, his family had experienced voter fraud, and that requiring photo ID was just a common sense measure that should be implemented in the election place. And I should say, Rhode Island, if you look at its Democratic makeup, is basically a one-party state. You know, it's a Democratic party state, and yet they overwhelmingly passed a photo ID requirement. Now, is photo ID the only answer? No. I mean, in this book, I have a whole series of recommendations on different steps that need to be taken. But photo ID is, to quote the Chicago Tribune, which just ran an editorial about this, which is not exactly a conservative editorial page. The Chicago Tribune just said, weak ID laws are an invitation to cheating, and the best time to close an avenue to such behavior is before it happens, not after. Now, what can a photo ID requirement do? Well, one, it can stop impersonation fraud at the polls. Now, you keep hearing there's not a lot of impersonation fraud. That may be true, but in this book, we have many examples of it, including a great case out of Brooklyn, New York. A state grand jury report was made public in the mid-1980s in Brooklyn. The grand jury was called by the Democratic district attorney, Elizabeth Holtzman, former Democratic congresswoman from New York, who went back after Congress and became a local district attorney. Those of you who have taken criminal law know that grand jury reports are usually secret. But this grand jury and the DA believed that what they found was so important, they published their report. What did they find? Well, they found that for 14 years in Brooklyn, there had been a successful voter fraud conspiracy that had cast literally thousands of ballots, fraudulent ballots, in state, legislative, and congressional, particularly Democratic primaries. And how had they done it? Well, they had recruited crews of 6 to 8 people, 20 crews usually for each election, and those crews went from polling place to polling place to polling place, voting in the names of dead voters, voters who had moved, and fraudulent voters because they had successfully registered fraudulent individuals using the mail-in voter registration that New York had at the time. Now, one of the ways they did this was that New York, like a lot of states, has a ballot petition requirement to become a candidate. In other words, you've got to get a certain number of registered voters to sign a petition to be a candidate on the ballot. So these individuals would get the list of registered voters from the county, and they would go knocking door to door to get registered voters to sign their petitions. Well, every now and then, people would come to the door and say, oh, well, that person is dead, or that person has moved away. And they would make a little note about that. They wouldn't notify the county election officials that had gotten a list from that these people were dead or had moved away. And on election day, they sent folks in to vote in those people's names. And that's how they successfully carried this out. Now, the other thing that opponents will say to you is that, well, the only thing photo ID does is prevent impersonation fraud. That is completely false. The other thing it can prevent is people voting under false registrations. Everything from a fraudulent name to people who are real voters, but they register under an address where they don't really live. Are there cases like that? Well, yes, there are, including a big Department of Justice prosecution in the 1990s in Philadelphia, where people who didn't even live in the state were registering in Philadelphia so they could vote in the city. There's another case down in Florida, Miami, 1997. The Miami Herald actually won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation of massive voter fraud in a mayor's race. There were 5,000 fraudulent ballots cast in that election, and one of the things that they found were people who didn't live in Miami were registering at false addresses in Miami because they wanted to vote in that particular race. Now, the other thing it'll prevent is voting by illegal aliens if you are requiring a government-issued photo ID. There are lots of examples of that. And also, it can potentially prevent double voting. That is, people voting in more than one state. And I can give you another good example of that that came up quite to the embarrassment of the League of Women Voters. When the Indiana photo ID case was before the United States Supreme Court, the League of Women Voters filed an amicus brief. All right, those of you who are law students and you're learning to become lawyers, this provides a great lesson in making very sure that you know all the facts that you are asserting in a brief you file with a court. Because in their brief, they named a specific Indiana woman, a registered voter in Indiana, saying this woman had had a terrible time voting in the state because of this terrible photo ID requirement. Well, a local Indiana newspaper decided to go interview her and find out why had she had a problem voting. Well, according to the newspaper's story, the reason she'd had a problem voting in Indiana was because when she went to her polling place, she pulled out a Florida driver's license, not an Indiana driver's license. And not only did she have a Florida driver's license, but she was registered to vote in Florida also, because she had taken advantage of Motor Voter, and when she'd gone and gotten her driver's license, she'd also registered to vote in the state. Not only that, but she and her husband, who owned a second home in Florida, for those of you who've taken property law, she had applied for a homestead exemption on her property taxes in Florida. You don't apply for a homestead exemption unless you're claimed to be a resident of the state. So the Indiana law worked exactly as designed. It prevented somebody who could have easily double voted if they'd wanted to without getting caught. And it's kind of auspicious that we are having this today, because I don't know if you all have seen this yet, but there's a big news story breaking in Washington. James O'Keefe, who is the guy who released the famous Acorn undercover videos, has released a video today of an undercover volunteer going into the Houston office of Organizing for America, which is a DNC operation, and the volunteer says, well, I'm a voter here in Texas, but I really would like to also vote in Florida. And the director of the OFA office helps her and gives her all the paperwork so she can double vote in Florida, which is a felony under federal law. Now, you're going to hear opponents also say that, well, the whole intention of these photo ID laws are to suppress the vote. It's to keep racial minorities and Democrats out of the polls. Now, I'm going to give you some statistics, but before I do that, let me give you another quote. Now, I write a lot for National Review, which you all know is the flagship magazine of conservatives. Well, the equivalent flagship of liberals is the New Republic. And there's a great quote there from Nat Cohn, who is their analyst on election data, where he talks about Indiana and Georgia, which were the first states to put in a government-issued photo ID requirement. And here's his quote. They put these laws in before the 2008 election. Here's his quote. If voter ID requirements suppressed Democratic turnout in Georgia and Indiana, the effects were not readily observable in the final results. Now, why does he say that? Well, he says that because the actual certified election returns for those states show that not only did it not suppress the vote of African Americans, Hispanics, and Democrats, the votes of those particular blocks of individuals went up dramatically in those states. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I think the turnout went up dramatically because of the photo ID requirement. But the point here is that opponents for the last 5 years have been saying that it keeps people out of the polls, it will depress their turnout, and the actual election returns show that not to be true. In fact, the returns from Georgia are actually quite dramatic. Georgia is a Section 5 voting rights state. For those of you who've taken civil rights law, you know that means that Georgia cannot make a change in its rules governing elections without doing one of two things, either getting the pre-approval of the Justice Department or getting a 3-judge court panel in the District of Columbia to approve the law. Now, the Justice Department pre-approved Georgia's law saying it wasn't discriminatory. The law went in place. Georgia, because of this Voting Rights Act, keeps track of the race of every single registered voter. In 2008, when the photo ID law was in place for the first time in a presidential election, the turnout of black voters went up 42% over 2004, when there was no photo ID law in place. The turnout of white voters went up only 8%. The turnout of Hispanic voters went up 140%. Now, it is certainly true that we had a general increase in turnout across the United States in the 2008 election. In fact, we had a turnout of about 62%. That's probably the highest turnout, I think, in about 30 years in a presidential election. However, the Democratic turnout in Georgia in the 2008 election was up over 6 percentage points. That was the 5th largest increase in the United States. So that was much larger than many other states without photo ID. The overall increase in turnout in Georgia was 6.7 percentage points, the 2nd largest in the nation. Now, in the 2010 election, when Barack Obama was not on the ballot, there was a similar dramatic increase in turnout. The black turnout in 2010 was up 44% over 2006, the last midterm election when there was no photo ID law in place. The turnout of Hispanic voters was up 66.5%. And the increases in turnout of those racial blocks of voters was larger than the census shows there was an increase in the population of African Americans and Hispanics in those states. Now, the exact same thing happened in Indiana. In Indiana, the increase in Democratic turnout was over 8 percentage points, which was the largest increase in Democratic turnout of any state in the United States. And in the 2010 election, there was actually a larger turnout of black voters than even in the 2008 election. And for those who say this is some kind of plot to keep Barack Obama from winning, in 2008, you know who won Indiana? Which had the strictest photo ID law in the country? Barack Obama. And it was the first time a Democrat had won that state in 30 years. So this idea, again, that it's somehow keeping people out of the polls, we know is not true. By the way, that 8% increase in turnout in Indiana was twice the increase of the turnout in Illinois, which was his home state and which has no photo ID requirement. Now, I've spoken probably enough. Let me end with this. The idea that this is somehow Jim Crow, the reimposition of Jim Crow, is historically preposterous. Okay? There are many things you have to do to show a photo ID. You know, cash a check, buy a beer, get on an airplane. Now, opponents will say to you, oh yeah, but those aren't constitutional rights. You know, those aren't fundamental rights. You shouldn't have to show an ID for a fundamental right. Well, if you want to exercise your right to buy a gun under the Second Amendment, you're going to need a photo ID. If you want to exercise your right under the First Amendment to petition the government for redress of grievances, which is the modern word we use for that is lobbying, right? You want to get into a federal building in Washington where I work, you're not going to get in without a photo ID. In fact, the Justice Department, which, by the way, today just lost its lawsuit against the state of South Carolina over its photo ID law. I got an email right before I came in here saying that a 3-judge panel has ruled that South Carolina's photo ID law is not discriminatory. They just lost that case. You cannot get into the front door of the Justice Department without a photo ID. There are many other instances of this. If you want to access the federal courts, say in Washington, which is a fundamental right under you know, Article 5, to access the judicial system, you're going to need a photo ID to get in. And something that I thought very ironic was, you know, there's been a battle going on in Pennsylvania over their photo ID law. And at the very same time that the mayor of Philadelphia, a city that has had voter fraud prosecution after voter fraud prosecution, was saying that requiring a government-issued photo ID was just a terrible thing and we shouldn't require it and it's discriminatory. If you go to their website of the city of Philadelphia, you will find something very interesting. And this is very similar to other cities. Those of you, again, who have taken constitutional law or civil rights law, you may be familiar with the Loving versus Virginia decision. This was a decision where the United States Supreme Court held that marriage is a fundamental civil right and tossed out, thank goodness, Virginia's ban on interracial marriage. If you want to apply for a marriage license in Philadelphia, you not only need a government-issued photo ID, they want a second form of ID. And the same is true in the District of Columbia, whose city council members and others have come out against photo ID. So if you want to exercise that fundamental civil right to get married, the ID requirements are actually stricter than what states have passed. Finally, every state that has passed a law like this has provided a free ID for anyone that doesn't have one. And again, the opponents have these huge, totally statistically ridiculous estimates saying that large numbers of Americans don't have ID. Well, both the Indiana and the Georgia lawsuits were the subject of federal lawsuits. In the Indiana case, it was a constitutional claim. In the Georgia case, it was both a constitutional and a Voting Rights Act claim. After 2 years of litigation, the plaintiffs in those cases lost the cases. The cases were dismissed. And what is interesting about those cases is the almost identical language from two separate federal court trial judges about the fact that in both cases the plaintiffs had come in claiming that there were hundreds of thousands of voters in each state who had no photo ID, wouldn't be able to vote. They could not produce anyone who actually would be unable to vote in the case. In the Georgia case, the court said, although plaintiffs claim to know of people who claim that they lack photo ID, plaintiffs have failed to identify those individuals. The failure to identify those individuals is particularly acute in light of the plaintiff's contention that a large number of Georgia voters lack acceptable photo ID. The NAACP, who was a plaintiff in that case, couldn't even come up with a single one of their members who would be unable to vote because of the ID requirement. Almost identical language in the Indiana case. The federal trial court judge said, despite apocalyptic assertions of wholesale voter disenfranchisement, plaintiffs have produced not a single piece of evidence of any identifiable registered voters who would be prevented from voting pursuant to the Indiana law. And this was particularly emphasized by what happened in the Philadelphia case. You all may have seen that last week a state court judge in Pennsylvania issued an order basically upholding the photo ID law, although saying it won't be in place for this election because there's not enough time to implement it. He had earlier issued a decision upholding the law, and he issued his decision on a Wednesday. On a Thursday, the Philadelphia, I think the Inquirer, had a story about the lead plaintiff in that case. It was a 93-year-old African-American woman who said that she had no photo ID, she wouldn't be able to get one, she wouldn't be able to vote in the upcoming election. She was the main witness in that case for the NAACP and the League of Women Voters. The judge issued his decision on a Wednesday upholding the law. On Thursday, she went down to her local DMV office and promptly got a photo ID. And that shows the kind of exaggeration that has gone on in these cases. We are one of the only Western democracies that does not require photo ID uniformly when we vote. Our northern neighbor Canada does. Our southern neighbor Mexico does. Mexico has a much larger population in poverty than we do. They've had no problems with their photo ID law. In fact, a lot of people credit the implementation of a photo ID requirement in the 1990s as the reason why the opposition party in Mexico won the presidency in Mexico for the first time in, I think, 70 years. It is a common sense requirement, one that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I asked Dr. Wood to speak because I see him as a straight shooter, and I know people have to go to class, so as a straight shooter, and will call things as they are, and is good at seeing both sides. Dr. Wood is a professor of political science here at UND. He attended Weber State in Utah, where he received an undergraduate degree in political science. He went to work as a labor market economist for the state of Utah. And following that work experience, he went back to school and received his graduate degrees from the University of Washington and joined the UND staff in 2003. Dr. Wood.
Well, okay, so, I mean, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time. I actually think that a lot of the points, I agree with a lot of the points that have been said here. And I can't, you know, I'm a policy person. I'm a political science, trained in political science, and I'm used to thinking about societal sort of policies, problems. And so as I was listening and as I was thinking about it, I mean, I actually have more questions for these guys than points that I really want to share with you. But I do want to maybe just throw out a different way of sort of thinking about this. It seems to me that much in the same way, as a society, we're trying to balance. We're always trying to balance multiple objectives, right? We're, in the judicial system, we're trying to balance public order with protection of individual liberties and due process and that sort of thing, correct? And then it seems in this case, in this instance, one of the many ways that you can frame this discussion is that it is a balance between ensuring access, maximum level of access to polling places, and ensuring the integrity of the election, the legitimacy of the election. And so it seems to me that any policy that you're going to consider ought to evaluate those things, and we ought to be looking for the very best combination of objectives. Where can we retain the most access, the least restricted access, without jeopardizing the legitimacy of the election. And so in that sense, I'm a little bit, clearly this is a trend. I mean, from what I've been reading, and this is not my area of expertise. Tim's right, he knows me, he asked me to do this. There are probably many people here on campus who would be better suited to be sitting in this chair than me. But I was surprised to discover that there are something like 30 states in the country that have some sort of some version of voter ID laws, and that so clearly this is a trend. Clearly this is something that's gaining political steam, momentum, and there and it should be concerning to everybody, because we can all look back at plenty of our history. I mean, there certainly have been times where voter fraud was rampant. I mean, anybody that's ever studied the political machines and patronage era, I mean, that there were times when our elections were not terribly fair. So I'm not, I'm all for any kind of measures that we want to take that we want to implement that will ensure legitimacy of the process, as long as it doesn't too much impact the other side of that equation. And I think that's sort of the same place the Supreme Court came down on that Crawford decision in 2008 that he mentioned. So my concerns, again, as sort of an outsider looking in and coming into this program, this discussion for the first time for this panel, really. I know political scientists always tend to frame things, especially voting, in terms of economic theory, in terms of costs and benefits and rational choice, and that if that there's really relatively low individual benefits that any individual person gets from voting. I mean, you get the chance, the likelihood that your specific vote is going to make a difference on the outcome is minuscule and not big enough to really offset very much in terms of costs. And so, you do get that sense of civic duty, and you do get the solidarity benefits and the little cool sticker that says, hey, hug me, I voted, right? I mean, there's some external things that you get that in some ways offset that. But the trouble is that, balancing that are the costs. In most states you have to go through some sort of registration process. You still have to, you have to arrange your schedule such to take time off. You have to figure out where you're supposed to vote. You have to actually go there. If there's a line, you have to wait. You have to figure out the form. And, and so adding another layer onto this, the Supreme Court in their, so far, at least current law, they don't seem to see a whole lot of extra impact from these kinds of laws. And I would actually agree with them almost entirely if the impact was going to be proportionate. But it looks like from the social science literature, and agreed, there's not very much. I mean, I think the biggest message I would leave today is that we need to know more. We need to know, first of all, how many people there are out there that don't have IDs and that it would be a big burden for them to get them. We need to know, if there are people that would have voted if there was no requirement that didn't vote because there was a requirement. We need to know if there is any impact on turnout between places that have voter ID and places that don't, and we need to know that stuff, over a period of time. I mean, I don't think, no disrespect to the 2008 election, but there was a lot about that was unusual. And same thing with 2010. I mean, they're very high intensity elections. They're not, it's hard to read anything into that. There's a lot of noise in that scenario. So, I guess I'm a little concerned, and you hear the partisan kind of, accusations on both sides, and I tend to try and filter those out. I tend to try and say, what is the best policy? What's going to provide us with the best system that is the most accessible for the greatest number of people, and then let's do that. Let's figure out what that is. I did want to throw, since I've got the microphone and all, I'm going to throw a question at Al, because there's something here that has always, I've got two questions that had always troubled me, and I would love to hear, it seemed like hearing you describe the process, I couldn't figure out two things. Number one, how would you know if somebody was actually a citizen? I mean, that's a requirement, but if they show up and they've got a utility bill or even a driver's license, how do we determine, how would you stop somebody who's not a citizen from voting? And the second one seems like, as they were describing it, I was imagining somebody could go through the garbage can and, here in Grand Forks and pick up a utility bill and go in and vote, and then if the real person went in later and voted, I don't know if you don't have to sign your name, or there's no way, if nobody could, how would we be able to distinguish between whether that person tried to vote twice or whether it was some random stranger that impersonated the first person? And
Well, I can answer the second question real quickly. I suspect that a utility bill in the garbage can would not have the person's birth date on it. And so unless they can match up a name and a birth date, that would pretty much take care of that. Okay. Your other question is a little bit more challenging because at this point, other than the law saying that you have to be a United States citizen, there is no requirement that you have to prove that you're a United States citizen. And still, I think that we've had one case that I know where we had someone from a doctor, actually a Canadian who had been here a long time, that probably would not have voted in a state election, but voted in a city election, and but then they, it became evident that they couldn't. So could that happen? Yes, it definitely could, and the requirement to implement something like that, when we first did the voter ID, we had particularly some in the elderly population who had served in the military, who were very adamant about, I served my country, I don't have to show ID, and that's gone by the wayside. But I think a point that was made earlier, for just about anything else that we do in our life, it's interesting that you are required to have a photo ID, and yet when it comes to voting, we don't think that that's maybe necessary requirement. So,
just a really quick follow-up, because the only reason I wondered about this was, so much is changing in the western part. We've got all these new people, right? Tens of thousands of new people, and it's likely to keep going. Are you worried about that? I would think your office would be kind of troubled by that development, and I wonder if we're going to have to develop new policies and new things, because there's
I can tell you that voter registration won't solve it. One of the things with voter registration, and that I've picked up from my colleagues in other states, is that the federal laws that govern voter registration really hamper the cleansing of registration lists when they know the people no longer live there, but they have this requirement that they got to keep stuff for a certain period of time. That's a bureaucracy that we don't need to get into. Right now, yes, we do have a population increase, and yes, we have talked about it. Again, registration isn't going to make any difference. They still need to come in. If they vote, they do have to sign, if they vote absentee, they have to sign an affidavit that this is where they live. And again, under North Dakota law, you know, United States citizen, we assume that they are because we can't ask for anything. 18 years of age, that's the part of the proof with part of the identification, and you only have to have lived here 30 days. And even in a state that has voter registration, I don't know of any states that have voter registration that extends out more than 30 days. I know that today, I guess in some states, is the cutoff for voter registration. Minnesota happens to have same-day registration. So, okay, you go over to Minnesota and vote, and you show your ID. You come to North Dakota and vote, show your ID. You know, I don't know that anything got solved there. So, but again, they have to sign an affidavit saying that they are what they are. So,
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. And now we can open up for questions. We're going to have a roving mic, and also if the speakers have questions for each other, I'm going to go ahead and start. Well, actually, does anyone have any questions off the bat? Yes.
Secretary Jaeger, I know you kind of alluded to the fact that you believe the lack of voter registration in North Dakota sort of contributes to preventing fraud in our state. Are you aware of any movements in any other states to perhaps go the way of North Dakota and eliminate voter registration?
I'm not aware of anything, but I know a lot of my colleagues who would very much like to get rid of it. Basically, they look at us as unusual. I always get the question, how does it work? And I've never really come up with a good answer. All I can say is it works. I'm hopeful that I'm very wrong that he doesn't have North Dakota in here, because I've been secretary for 20 years, and I'm not aware of anyone. We've only had a couple cases where people have attempted to vote in 2 places. But off the top of my head, I think it's only been 2 or 3. So we do have a system in place. Our central voter file, again, when you come in, you have to produce some type of identification, and once you're in the system, that's proof or evidence that you have voted. It's not that you are entitled to vote, that you voted. And if you try to do it any other place, it's going to come up in the system, and you're going to be found out. That's one of the benefits that I really see that we were able to do out of the Help America Vote Act, is to get a centralized database, and it's just a database that's centralized of information that's been public record for many years.
Is that instant, or is it like, would it be after the fact that you would match those? So you would show up when you went into the second place, they would see that you've already voted.
Right.
That's good. I like that.
Thank you. Other questions?
So, Secretary Jaeger, in our state, we have a lot of citizens who go to Arizona in the winter and then go to Florida in the winter, and they might go right around election time.
I would suspect a lot of them have already applied for their absentee ballot, and it's in the process of being taken care of.
So, our centralized system is a list of all the people in our state that have voted. Is that compared? For instance, if someone voted in Florida and voted in Arizona, would our votes be compared with those 2 states to prevent someone from voting in both places?
That's a good question, but at the present time, there is no database of that size comparing voter registration states with voter registration states. So, but there is communication in the election community. I mean, we do receive information if somebody has registered in another state. You know, we get a letter. You know, could that happen? You know, that's just one of the things. I'm not going to sit here and say things can't happen, because they can. And in some cases, we just have to trust the people, you know, that's what they're doing. There is a strong thing about voting at home, and I would suspect that people that do enter other places, you know, really want to vote at home. Where we get into rather interesting election questions is maybe in an area that might surprise you. It's township elections.
Yeah, because they're small.
Just because you own property in a township, that is not one of the requirements for voting. So you could own, you know, half the township, and you want to, but you live in town. You live outside the township. You have to be a qualified elector, meaning that you have to have a residency in that township, and we have asked the legislature to pass a law, because we've had cases where people have maintained a rural post office box alongside the road, and there isn't a house close by. And now the law says that there has to be a dwelling that somebody can actually inhabit.
And let me just add one follow-up to this. I mean, I think we should also remember that the penalties for casting a vote, say in Arizona and here, are pretty severe. I mean, you know, if you're balancing again, you know, you know, what's the impact of my vote going to be compared to what is the, you know, the penalty if I'm discovered? I mean, it's a pretty powerful disincentive for a lot of people. I mean, I don't know that. Do you know the specifics?
I have to just disagree with that, because if the idea of committing a felony prevented people from committing crimes, our jails would be empty. And particularly in the voting area, it is easy to get away, for example, with double voting. Because I'm telling you, you could vote here and vote in Florida, and your chances of getting caught are just about zil. And people, to give you a good example of this, there was a report, I think we talk about it in the book, where the New York Daily News some years ago did a comparison of New York City's voter registration list with Florida's, because a lot of people in New York are snowbirds, and they go to Florida. And they found thousands of people, exact data matches of people who clearly were registered in both states. And they found several hundred who had voted in both Florida and New York in the 2000 and 2002 election. They went and interviewed one of the guys, and he said, yeah, I voted in both states. I really didn't like George Bush, and I wanted to vote against him twice. I mean, that was the reaction. He didn't care about the penalty for it, because like I said, the chances of getting caught are just about nil. They would never have discovered this except that a newspaper did this comparison. The lady that I talked about earlier in Maryland, who had to withdraw her congressional race, election officials didn't discover that she had registered and voted in both Maryland and Florida. The only reason it was discovered was because she became a candidate, and somebody was doing opposition research on her, and they figured this out. Otherwise, she would never have been caught.
Hang on. Is there any way that, would voter ID laws, any of the laws that we've got in Indiana or any of them, would that fix that?
Well, voter, you know, one of the ways people do that is, particularly students, unfortunately, is they'll vote where they are in college and then do an absentee ballot from their home state and vote twice, which is a federal felony. The only way to stop that is to do, you know, we were talking about photo ID for in-person voting, but a number of states, including Pennsylvania, have taken a second step, which is something I recommend in the book, which is something that every state should do, and that is they put in a requirement for voter ID also for absentee balloting. Kansas, for example, put in a requirement that says when you request an absentee ballot, you got to provide either a photocopy of the same ID that's required for in-person voting, or if you have a Kansas driver's license, your Kansas driver's license number. That would make it much tougher unless you're breaking the law and getting driver's licenses from 2 states, which you're not supposed to do either. So yeah, does it eliminate it? No, but that would make it harder to commit that kind of fraud.
We do, in our database, we do automatically get DOT information. So even if a person may have never voted, their name might be in our system as being inactive. And again, when they come to the polls, having their name in the central database doesn't mean that they're entitled to vote. It just means that their name is there. Part of it is just the efficiency of running the election, because if you come in, show your ID, the address is right there. If it's not, then there's another manual process. And the reason, and I should have probably emphasized it more with the students, is that it takes time to do an affidavit at the polling location. That's why we highly recommend, and we actually met with the chancellor yesterday to encourage that all of you get a broadcast message urging you, if you're going to vote where you are going to college, to print out that letter, because that will just speed up the voting process.
I'm just wondering if there's any data that shows that voter ID would limit voter fraud. I mean, somebody mentioned Canada, and in our most recent federal election, 7 members of parliament who were elected are facing legal challenges because of widespread voter fraud by the Conservative Party.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. You
So
repeat that?
Does voter ID actually limit voter fraud? Is there any data that would show that?
Well, in the Texas photo ID trial, which occurred about a month and a half in Washington, D.C., one of the pieces of evidence that Texas presented was that in the May primary, so that's this year, in the May primary in Texas, 219 individuals showed up to vote in person at polling places in Texas who records later showed were dead. Now, if their photo ID requirement had been in place, whoever those people were wouldn't have been able to do that. Now, 219 votes doesn't sound like a lot of votes out of how big Texas is, but in fact, one of the other pieces of evidence that Texas presented was a whole long list of state legislative races that have been decided by a couple of dozen votes. And the real point here is that, people, when we talk about this, people are always thinking about presidential elections where you have big numbers. But we have literally thousands of elections in this country every year, and they are elections down at the county, the township, the state level, and particularly county and city elections. They are often decided by a handful of votes. And it doesn't take a lot of fraud to turn an election like that. And the other thing that I think a lot of people, particularly in bigger cities, don't understand, and this is something we talk about in the book, is that particularly in rural areas of the United States, poor areas of the United States, where the county government is the source of money and jobs, there is a huge incentive to steal votes and to retain and get elected. And that, unfortunately, all too often tempts people into stealing elections so they can stay in office, because when they're in office, then they have the ability to dole out jobs, to dole out city and county money, and so the temptation is there. And a lot of the cases we talk about here are cases that occurred in those kind of conditions, smaller rural counties where stealing a vote was vital for these people to be able to stay in office.
Could you not still have a fraudulent photo ID?
Oh, sure, you can get a fraudulent photo ID, but no security, anybody who does security on computer networks will tell you, no security is perfect. The whole point is to make it more difficult to commit fraud. If you can just walk into a polling place and vote in the name of somebody who you know is dead, but is still registered to vote, and there's no voter ID required, well, you can easily get away with it and maybe cast an extra vote or two for the candidate you want to think. If there's an ID requirement, you have to go to the trouble of getting a fake ID, which is not quite as easy a project. And maybe you can do it, but it makes it more difficult to commit fraud. Security is a measure of making those kind of things more difficult to commit. At the same time, making sure that everybody who's eligible still gets to vote.
I just need to comment on one thing. Those of you that are law students, I can assure you from my office, you cannot ever pass a law where somebody won't figure out how to get around it. We can't, in election law and some different things, you cannot imagine the way people can screw up a ballot. I mean, you can't even think of it. And once you think you have it all covered on some issue, guess what? You have another issue. And so I've just learned it's just kind of impossible to have a law that, you know, covers everything, because somebody will figure out something that nobody ever thought of. And they don't necessarily do it maliciously. It's just done.
I have a question for Mr. Spakovsky. You touched on like rural counties. What about these big American cities? I'm thinking of places like Chicago and Detroit that have been controlled by one particular party for decades. Is voter fraud as pervasive as it may be in like elections where the margins are small for either side?
Well, what's interesting about that is people usually think about voter fraud as being one party trying to steal the election from the other. But in fact, a lot of the cases we talk about here are inter-party theft. You know, some of the cases we talk about, for example, occurred in Democratic primaries because these are one-party counties. And a great example of that occurred in Troy, New York. Last year, 4 local Democratic officials were convicted of fraud, and they were basically stealing from other Democrats. And one of the guys, one of the consultants, campaign consultant, when he was interviewed by the police, said, well, this is the accepted way of doing things. We always do it like this. And so, look, it's not that Republicans don't commit voter fraud. They do. In fact, there's been a whole series of convictions recently in Kentucky of local county Republican officials, particularly county sheriffs, for vote buying. And the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, was supplied by local drug dealers who were trying to buy silence and cooperation from these county officials. But a lot of the fraud that you see occurs in big city machines, as you were just talking about. Philadelphia, probably one of the worst places today. And back when Republicans controlled the big cities, they committed this kind of fraud. But they pretty much lost control in the 50s. The Meehan dynasty controlled Philadelphia until the 1950s, and then basically the city was taken over by the Democrats. And that's why you see fraud in some of these machines. Philly is probably one of the worst places. There have been a lot of prosecutions there and convictions of people for committing voter fraud.
You know, I kind of want everybody to know here too that there is some research out there on this voter fraud, and since some of these voter ID amendments have been passed in some of the states, in 2009 we had an issue, a symposium of one of our political science journals came out with several studies, and it showed that there was some sort of impact on. They're a lot more sophisticated methodologically than kind of what you have going on here. I mean, 2008, a lot of African-American turnout when Barack Obama's running for office in the South, probably something that you're going to expect to see a little bit more. And then, of course, you also have Senate races in 2010, or a governor's race in 2010. And you can't really control for the amount of money that's spent, too, in some of those races, or some of those races that are actually going to turn out voters. And I think we forget sometimes, too, that in 2008, Georgia had actually been kind of a targeted state, too, for Obama administration. Toward the very, very end of the election, they started targeting Georgia. And so, of course, what they would probably try to do is turn out some of the African-American vote. But what we don't know from this study right here is how many of those African-Americans that wanted to vote were turned away because of that voter ID. With some more sophisticated methodology, those are the types of things we can figure out. But it's a little bit more tougher if you're looking at the raw numbers just like this. So.
Well, I just have to disagree with that. They've had 5 years of elections in Georgia, okay? Not just 2 federal elections, but they've had numerous state and local elections also. And also, you can tell how many people are turned away from polls by the number of provisional ballots that are issued. Everybody know what a provisional ballot is, right? If you show up at a polling place and you don't have an ID, you're issued a provisional ballot. The number of people who were unable to vote, who were issued a provisional ballot because they didn't have an ID, was tiny. And the other statistics, what I didn't even talk about, is the fact that in Georgia, they've got statistics on the number of people they've issued free IDs to. And they have a very good system there it makes it very easy to get a free ID. So if there were huge numbers of individuals without an ID, then Georgia would, in the last actually 6 years, have issued very large numbers of free IDs. That's not been the case at all. In fact, with 6 million registered voters, the number of people who had applied for a free ID who didn't already have one was, on average, every year less than 0.05%. I mean, it's a tiny number. And one of the reasons for that, particularly if you're poor, is if you want to apply, for example, for public assistance, welfare, in almost all the states, you've got to have a government-issued photo ID. They require that as part of the federal requirements that are being administered by the states. This idea that if you're poor, you don't need an ID, no, that's just not the case, particularly if you look at all these other laws that have those similar kind of requirements in.
So just a follow-up, you said that there was, you can tell by the provisional ballot.
I don't have the exact numbers, but I know from talking to the Secretary of State there that it was a very tiny number. I mean, and like Kansas, I don't have the paper with me. I actually did a paper on the Kansas's experience this year. With their elections, they've got 1.7 million registered voters, and in their elections, they issued like 83 provisional ballots. Half of the people came back with an ID. They already had one. So the number of people who actually didn't get to vote because of an ID requirement, again, was just a tiny, tiny percentage. And those individuals can easily get a free ID because that's what Kansas provides, just like every other state.
I guess my real concern with this is that it's become such a polarizing issue at all. I mean, why is it left and right? Why is it Democrat and Republican? I mean, this should be an American issue. You know, we should want everyone to vote, especially with the such heinous history of this country's voter suppression, you know, all the way from, the indecency and indignity of slavery, the 3/5 rule, the grandfather clause, like the civil rights movement in the 60s. I mean, all of these different instances. Why is it such a polarizing issue?
Well, you're going to have to ask the leadership of certain liberal groups and the Democratic Party. Their constituents don't agree with them. The polling on this is actually very remarkable. If you look at the polling, particularly Rasmussen, who's done a lot of polling on photo ID and voter fraud, you find that Americans overwhelmingly support a voter ID requirement, and it runs across all race and ethnic lines, and it runs across party lines. Democrats, Republicans, blacks, whites, Hispanics, a majority of them support photo ID. So they don't agree with what a lot of their leadership is saying. And in some states, even those officials, I gave Rhode Island as an example. It's an all-Democratic state. People there had experience with voter fraud. They put in a photo ID requirement. Kansas is a similar story. Kansas, if you look at the final passage of their photo ID law, a majority of the Democratic legislators in both the House and Senate voted to approve this requirement. So I think that is changing. I'm afraid there's a lot of people who use this as a way of trying to turn out their base, get them enraged, raise money, and the data just doesn't support any of the claims they're making about it.
But hang on, let me throw in one thing quick. Because I had the same question. I had the same question you did. And it seems there's a couple of things. I mean, You know, I think the idea, I don't know exactly about the whole, what the provisions are for these states that are offering the free IDs, but the whole point, you know, the argument that they make is that it's not, everybody's not impacted equally, right? That there are, for whatever the segment of the population is that doesn't have an ID already. And I agree with you. It's hard to imagine functioning in a modern society without one, right? I mean, most of us use identification multiple times every day. So, I mean, it can't be a huge percentage of the population. However, that, you know, for those people, you know, you've got to, if you're going to go, if you're presumably going to show up, you have to go somewhere, so you have to take advantage. You don't have a driver's license. You have to somehow get to the place where they're going to issue this identification. But then the tricky part is you've got to have something to be able to prove who you are and what, you know, and your identity in order to get the state-issued identification. So even if they provide that for free, if you have to go get a birth certificate or if you have to get, you know, some other forms, and I'm not exactly sure what these other forms would be, but I don't know if those would be free. You know, if you have to go back to the hospital where you were born or some other records agency and get a birth certificate, then that's going to be a barrier for some people. And the people that are going to be most likely to be impacted by that are the people that are the most likely to not have an identification in the first place. I mean, I lost my ID once, and it was a total pain in the butt to get a new one. And you know, and we've had those experiences. So it's not inconceivable that you can imagine that there would be some issues. But you know, if they said, okay, here's the avenue, we're going to make it super easy for people to do this. We're going to reach out and help people so that everybody has the ID. I like that. I think the key thing people are worried about for the disenfranchisement argument is that if everybody's just left to their own devices to meet this requirement without any real help other than saying, well, you know, we'll waive the cost of the card, then it's not going to affect everybody equally. It's going to affect the poor people, though, the people at the very bottom disproportionately, and I think that's really the biggest worry.
Yeah, and I agree that I think it is constitutional, but it's been struck down in Pennsylvania, in Texas, and in Wisconsin, and I believe
it has not been struck down in Pennsylvania.
Didn't it not just come out last week that
the court simply said it wouldn't be in effect for this election because it's too short a time period, but
I apologize, yes.
It's constitutional.
But they didn't say it wasn't constitutional, right? They just said that for this election, it's not going to be applied because of the application and the way that it was instituted. And I think that is the more prevailing issue. I mean, I guess what would your response be to Mr. Turzai, the House Republican leader, stating that voter ID is going to help Romney win Pennsylvania? I mean, I'm not responsible for what he says. My interest in this has to do purely with having a secure election. And I don't care who wins. What I want at the end of the day is that the losing candidate says, you know, I lost, but it was a fair election. And that's what we all should want to have. I don't know what he was referring to. I don't think that's correct. I think the only thing the ID requirement will do is cut down on some of the fraud that has occurred in prior elections in the state of Pennsylvania. And every state that has passed an ID requirement like this has included in that appropriations for a very large educational effort to make sure that everybody in the state knows about this and will be able to get an ID. And again, you got to go to the experience of the states that have had this in place for years. And all of these problems that everybody keeps talking about just haven't happened. I mean, they have not happened. And in the majority of lawsuits that have been filed against every single state that has passed photo ID law, the laws have been upheld. I mean, the opponents of this are fighting a long-term losing battle because in most of the cases, they keep losing.
How do voter ID laws work with just discouraging people from getting an ID? Because like I mean everyone hates going to the DMV, but you have to do it to drive. I mean just getting an ID card to to vote alone, I mean, just in that rational weighing of the factors basis, would people find it worth the time and effort to go do that?
Well, if you think voting is important, yeah. But again, look, I can't answer that question. I can just tell you, look at the statistics on turnout, and they show that it has not discouraged people from voting.
But wouldn't like the 08 numbers be more contributed to a very excited Democratic base rather than...
you weren't listening to what I said when I talked about that. The Georgia and Indiana increases were high. Look, you can't do an analysis just based on an increase in a state. If there's a general increase in turnout across the United States, what you have to do is compare the turnout in the state you're looking at, like Georgia and Indiana, and compare that to what happened in all the other states. And the statistics show that the increases in turnout in Georgia and Indiana were larger than the increases in turnout in other states.
But you're not arguing that photo ID laws actually increase turnout,
no, but my point is that opponents have been saying for years that this would depress turnout.
Okay, but
and not only did it not depress turnout in those states, the turnout was actually larger than other states. So this idea that it will somehow keep you from the polls, the statistics, the actual data, you know, not these speculations and guesses by like the Brennan Center, the actual data shows that did not happen.
Well, but if it increased, that suggests that something else is going on, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily, if it increased disproportionately to other states, and yet, you know, there's no argument that voter ID laws are going to increase voter participation, then something else must have been causing that increase. And it could have been masking. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying we can't tell. The fact that it wasn't the same, if it would have stayed exactly the same, I think your argument would be really solid. But the fact that it increased is troubling, because it says...
Troubling? Well, it gives you an indication that perhaps it increased the confidence, the public confidence of people in the election process. And I know...
more people went to the polls because they had more confidence in it?
I have a case in here, there's a whole chapter on it, about a voter fraud prosecution in Greene County, Alabama. And this was a democratically controlled county. The people whose votes were the people who were convicted, 11 individuals, were local incumbent officials, black African Americans, Democrats. And they were challenged by African American Democratic reformers who wanted to clean up the local government. Their election was stolen from them. The people who did the vote stealing were convicted. The NAACP and others went in, tried to stop the voter fraud prosecution, said the whole purpose of this was to suppress the vote of African Americans. That's why the Justice Department was prosecuting it. The turnout in that county went up after the prosecutions, and one of the witnesses called one of the FBI agents who had helped in the investigation, and she said, you know, I went to the polls this time and voted because I felt like this time my vote would count. And it was very clear that the prosecutions in that county, rather than doing what the NAACP claimed, which is that it would somehow keep blacks from going to the polls, actually increased the confidence of people, and the turnout went way up after the convictions.
Well, I have to say that's the first time I have heard that argument, that these laws are actually going to increase turnout.
You need to buy a copy of the book and read it.
Couldn't you argue that Georgia and Indiana being battleground states in 08 affected the turnout? I mean, the Democrat wasn't likely to vote in Indiana or Georgia in the previous elections because it was never going to be a Democratic state. But the fact that Obama motivated Democrats to go out and vote, couldn't that be the turnout difference, not the fact that it's now a fair election?
Barack Obama did not spend more money in Indiana and Georgia than he spent in a lot of other states. And yet they had some of the largest increases in turnout of any states in the country. So that explanation doesn't work.
Well, it does suggest something else. And I mean, I do have to think more about whether or not it could be that people...
If voter ID keeps people out of the polls, then it really wouldn't have mattered what he did to motivate people to get to the polls. I mean, there's no consistency in that argument. Well, if people are unable to get IDs and can't vote, then all the advertising in the world isn't going to let them go vote. Yeah, again, your argument has no consistency.
Yeah.
One more question?
Sure.
One more.
Sure. Yeah, my question was, ultimately, would you like to see a federal-based ID law or federal-based database or state-based?
No, look, I think states should maintain control of the election process. I don't think we should have a federal agency running everything, because I've worked for the federal government and I've been in Washington for 10 years, and there's almost nothing federal bureaucrats can't screw up. and frankly, I wouldn't want them in charge of. And I give you just a quick example of why leaving the states as the laboratories of democracy is a good idea, and not having a federal agency running things. And that is, look, after the 2000 election, there were all these, and the Secretary of State knows this, there were all these task forces formed all over the country talking about what kind of reform should we do. And in Georgia, the Secretary of State formed this task force who immediately said, oh, we need to switch the whole state over to electronic voting machines. You know, no more paper ballots, no more anything like that. Electronic voting machines, that's the way to go. That will have clean elections. There won't be any problems. Now, she switched the whole state over, and it was only after that people started questioning electronic voting machines and the fact that they don't have an audit trail, and it might be a little easier to jimmy the software, and a lot of states then pulled back and said, we don't want to switch to electronic voting machines. The point was, this was done in one state. If a federal agency had been running elections, they would have come up with a rule that said the entire country needs to switch over to electronic voting machines, because at the time that was the big thing. Everybody thought they were the answer. And that's not a good way to run elections, is having a bunch of federal bureaucrats saying, well, this is how you have to do everything in every part of the country.
I've been,
You'd probably agree with that.
very active in the National Association of Secretaries of State. And across party lines, every state, we want to keep the feds out of it. I mean, we have an election committee. We have everybody in there bipartisan. We have seen more congressional bills that have been introduced that are so poorly written, introduced by people who have no clue how to run an election, and heaven forbid that they would even go and ask some of us who have what we think. This one-size-fits-all mentality, that something like that. There might be Help America Vote Act. You know, that was unique in the way that was written. Quite frankly, there's provisions in there that no other federal law has. But the more you have people from the federal government monkeying in, the secretary from New Hampshire, who's Bill Gardner, who has served now over 30 years, is very adamant that this, and he's a Democrat, very adamant that this should be state control. Very adamant.
I agree with that.
Well,
The Constitution requires it. I mean, the Constitution delegates the power to run this elections to the states. I mean, you'd have to change that. That's a pretty big hurdle in our current political climate.
Well, I want to take this opportunity as the faculty advisor for Federalist Society to thank our distinguished speakers, and please give them a round of applause. And also thank our Tim Heise as our moderator, and the other officers of the Federalist Society for their great work in organizing this event. And thank you for your attention and great questions. And I think it was an outstanding presentation and discussion. Thank you.